Good evening, San Diego. It is such a pleasure to be here. Now, I'm not sure how many of you understood what ARO means. ARO is Association for Research in Otolaryngology, and Nina and I are two proud members of this organization. What that means for you in the audience, those of you that are not part of ARO, it means that you might have a world-class auditory neuroscientist sitting right next to you. And so, throughout this presentation, if you have any questions about what we're talking about, you might have a true master of the craft sitting right next to you that can explain some of these concepts to you. Now, Nina and I are really thrilled to be here. We're going to kind of take a kaleidoscopic approach to music in the brain. These are obviously two huge topics, two things that we're deeply passionate about, deeply obsessed with, you might say. And we're going to try to tell you a little bit about what scientists have to say about music, and also what music has to say about science. And so it's really our great honor to speak to you tonight. We thank you for your time, and we thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about my own story. So as a kid, I was always obsessed with sound. It was like the only thing I cared about. I really couldn't understand why, but people were important, but sound, it was always something I wanted to know more about. And then I was like, well, how do we do this? All we have is this little ear. And so I kept looking at the ear. And I was like, it was such a small little hole. How is it possible that through these two ears, our entire auditory world can be constructed? And so, because I never had the courage to become a musician, I decided once I went into medicine that I should try to become a hearing specialist. And I've been really, really fortunate to study how we hear. Now, the fact that you can hear my voice is a pretty extraordinary thing. And for those of you that have never really contemplated how this happens, let me walk you through this a little bit. Now, when we think of sound, what we're really talking about is vibrations, vibrational energy that's in the air. And this vibration sets air into motion and goes into your ear canal where it hits your eardrum or your tympanic membrane. And what you see behind me here is a cross-section, a beautiful drawing through what's called the temporal bone, or the structures of the ear. And so the eardrum is a membrane that gets set into motion where the sound vibrations that get channeled down three little hearing bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, where they then enter what's called the inner ear. Now here a remarkable thing happens, because in the inner ear is where sound ceases to be acoustic. Okay? What I mean by that is that initially when you hear something, it is the vibrations that you're hearing, but in the inner ear, that vibration gets transformed into electricity. And once it's past the cochlea, which is the inner ear, sound is no longer vibrational at all. It's entirely electrical. Okay? So what that means is that our concept of the auditory world, when you hear my voice, when you hear beautiful music, that was electrically reconstructed in your brain. Okay? Now, is there anyone here who doesn't feel a little bit better now than they felt 6 seconds ago? Okay? And that is the power of music. Now, back when I was beginning my training, I was hoping that I would really understand music like Beethoven. I was like, I really want to get to this idea of why people would change their lives for music and why they would sort of, in a way, sacrifice everything they have to basically pursue the craft of music. When I got into the fields of otology and audiology, I was a little disappointed because there's a lot of this. Right? So, a lot of blips and bleeps. I sense a lot of you have had hearing tests, if that's pretty familiar to you. Now, it's not that that's not important or useful. In fact, it's maybe the most useful form of sound out there for a scientist because it's the purest kind of sound, a simple vibrating sine wave. But it's not music, or it's not what we think of when we think about music. So tonight we're going to take you on a kind of a whirlwind tour about the neuroscience of music and try to cover some stories about how we get from this structure of the ear and to this magnificent thing of the brain. Now, a lot of people that are not in the field of science are always looking towards the answers. And I would say that Nina and I are more asking the questions because we know that the answers are probably not really going to come in our lifetime. Sorry to say. I think that we're good at identifying what needs to be determined and good at just peeking in. We're scratching the surface of this tremendous thing.
So, as Charles said, sound. Sound is this incredibly powerful force, and it's invisible, but it is absolutely central to human communication. And the grass is rustling, and this animal has to make sense of sound. Making sense of sound is essential to survival. It is one of the most computationally difficult tasks that we ask our brain to do. Sound is very, very fast, which means, and in electricity, it means that the brain has to process this information in microseconds, which is why almost anyone who has a communication problem is going to have difficulty making sense of sound. That is, they're going to have difficulty hearing their friend's voice in a noisy place. Making music demands that one make sense of sound, because one needs to be able to hear the sound of your own instrument. You need to be able to hear harmonies, melodies. How does this work? So sound, in fact, the vibrations enter the ear, into our brain, and what is so important are the pathways that feed back to our hearing system and informs that hearing system according to the sounds that we have listened for during our lives, the sounds that have had meaning for us, the way we think about sound, so our memories of sound, what we pay attention to, and how we feel about sound. So we think of hearing as involving, we call it cognitive, sensory, and reward processes in the brain, and music just uses that and is the jackpot for how we hear. I'm going to play this piece here, and what you're going to be seeing is structural connectivity analysis of, here's a brain, picture of a brain, and during this Piazzolla piece, you can see that much of the brain is active. So you could see not only the hearing centers, but it's a widely distributed process.
Now you might wonder, is music made for the brain, or is the brain made for music? It's a hard question. Now, one thing is for sure, music is extremely old. And this may be the oldest musical instrument ever identified. 35,000 years ago, a bone flute. Now, if we try to think about life 3 years ago, not that different. 35 years ago, very different, very different. 350 years ago, wow, who could imagine life there? 3,500 years ago? Now let's zoom to 35,000 years ago. Why are human beings making flutes? Why do they care? What are they playing? What's their repertoire? Who's teaching them? It's very strange. It does seem that humans have been forever hardwired to seek music. That's true in all cultures, in all historical epochs. There has always been music. And so we think that there's something essential about music for the human experience. And it does seem that this has always been the case as long as we have been in existence. Now, it's probably worth defining. I'm not actually much for definitions, but it's worth saying, what are we talking about when we talk about music? It's sort of like obscenity. You sort of know it when you see it. You kind of know music when you hear it. But let's just call it organized sound. And let's say it's sound that's organized according to principles of pitch, rhythm, and harmony that employs various timbres to employ its effect in different dynamics. That's a starting point, and we're going to challenge some of that a little bit moving forward here. Now, obviously, music and language are the two kind of preeminent systems that get invoked when we talk about sound and the brain. And there are obvious similarities between the two. Both are complex forms of sound that are useful for human communication, but there are also vast differences. For one is that music is horrible at propositional thought. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. If I wanted to say, Dan, please meet me for lunch tomorrow at noon, right? That's all I have to say. It's done. Now, if I wanted to ask him to meet me for lunch at noon by playing my saxophone, I could probably play for about 10 years, and he might show up one day just to wonder what I'm doing, but it wouldn't be because of anything I said to him. And so music is not good at specific semantic thoughts. Now, acoustically, and this what I'm showing you here is the acoustics of speech and the acoustics of music. Language, most people don't understand this, language is a simpler acoustic phenomenon than music. It's easier. It's easier for the brain. It's easier for the ear. It has less dynamic range. It has less spectral range. And so in some ways, music is the hardest thing there is to hear. And because of that, we can refer to it as the pinnacle of hearing, and we can employ it as a tool to understand the highest capacities of the brain, rather than just the ability to walk or the ability to climb Mount Everest. Okay? And that is what music is. It's sort of the hardest thing that the brain can do with respect to sound. Now,
so rhythm. Rhythm is pretty obvious in music, but it turns out that rhythm is also very important for speech and language. Rhythm provides a temporal map for where meaning occurs. And there's been a whole line of research showing that the ability to have rhythmic skills and to simply even move to a beat aligns with language skills. So we've been looking at this as these skills develop in 3-year-olds. And so you're going to hear a 3-year-old tapping along to a beat. And then another little guy. So he's enthusiastic. But interestingly, the synchronizer has better language skills. Not only does he have better language skills, but we can look into how the brain processes sound. And what we can see is that here's the rhythm of the sound wave, and the synchronizer simply follows that rhythm. His brain follows the rhythm in the sound much more precisely. Do you ever wonder why your cat doesn't tap along to the beat, move its tail? Not a lot of animals can do that. Humans do it, and just a few species of birds. A couple other animals, that's about it. This is the famous Snowball.
Now, while it's hard to tell if Snowball is actually being creative or not, one thing is for sure, humans are extraordinarily creative. And this has been the hallmark of human existence, is that we've been able to solve our own problems, to innovate, to generate new ideas. We see this in architecture, we see it in food, we see it in the arts, we see it in science. Occasionally, we see it in surgery. We do keep it under control in the OR. Now, what I want to talk to you, though, is the kind of creativity that we see in a jazz musician. And so it's my pleasure to invite Gilbert Castellanos, who's just a monster on trumpet, one of the finest trumpet players you'll see, and the Gilbert Castellanos Jazz Trio playing Magnetism. Now, for those of you that are new to jazz, you might not quite have understood that the whole middle section, after they played the melody at the beginnings and the end, was improvised. What do I mean by that? I mean that this is music that they've never played before. In fact, they've never seen this piece until tonight because I wrote it. They've never seen it. And so, now they, no. Now, when the music is improvised, it means that they'll never be able to play it the same way again. If we told them to play it right now, they'd play a totally different improvised section. And so in a way, it's the brain creating on the spot, and it's, I think, a perfect model into human creativity. So what I've always wanted for is something like this, to be able to look into their head and say, how did they do what they just did? And so in the lab, when I was at the NIH many years ago, we started out with this idea that artistic creativity is magical, but it is not magic. It is a neurologic product. It's a product of the brain, and we should be able to measure it the same way we measure any other complex human behavior using rigorous neuroscientific methods. Now, the one modern equivalent we have today of slicing open Gilbert's head and looking inside is actually called functional MRI, or Fmri for short. Now, what this is just a regular MRI machine, which happens to be a pretty narrow tube, a big magnet. You can't move anything at all in terms of your head, and you can't bring any metal in. So those are the kind of the rules. But beyond that, anything is fair game. And so you can do almost any behavior in fMRI, and we can sort of examine the neural substrates of that behavior. Now, what's actually happening in this brain scan is amazing. It turns out that when your brain is active, it uses oxygenated hemoglobin. And the deoxygenated form, deoxyhemoglobin, is magnetically detectable. Okay? So the active brain consumes this hemoglobin, and you can detect a signal change in hemoglobin. And that's what we call BOLD, or blood oxygen level dependent imaging. And that's the whole premise by which modern functional MRI is performed. And when you do this, you get not just an anatomical understanding of where these structures are, but a statistical cluster of activity that says this part of the brain was likely active during this behavior. Now, how does this apply to an fMRI scanner? And so I'm going to show you a short video clip that is of me showing how we did an fMRI jazz experiment. And you're going to actually hear the same song that they just played, except much slower because I'm not that good.
So this is a plastic MIDI piano keyboard that we use for the jazz experiments, and it's a 35-key keyboard that is designed to fit both inside the scanner, be magnetically safe, have minimal interference that would contribute to any artifact, and have this cushion so that it can rest on the player's legs while they're lying down in the scanner playing on their back. And it works like this. This doesn't actually produce any sound. It sends out what's called a MIDI signal, or a musical instrument digital interface, through these wires into the box of the computer, which then trigger high-quality piano samples like this. That piano actually took 2 years to make, and so it was, it's dinky, but I'm proud of it. Now, if you look at the brain activity during the memorized music, the melody, and then the improvised section, you can do a comparison, or what we call a contrast. And this will show you brain activities that were sort of specific to improvisation. I'm showing you here kind of a simplified version of this that's basically suggesting that when musicians are improvising, at least solo jazz contexts, a large part of the prefrontal cortex, this front part of the brain that makes you human, that's partly responsible for conscious self-monitoring, for suppressing unwanted thoughts. This part of the brain shuts down during spontaneous creativity. In other words, during improvisation, in order to prevent their brains from stopping itself from generating new ideas, it turns off the self-monitor. And this is what we're seeing in these brain scans of spontaneous creativity. And so we're starting to have a peek into what's actually happening during something like jazz improvisation using science.
All right, so how do we get into the brain here some more on how do we use music as a window into the human brain? Continued. So as Charles said, when the brain is hearing sound, it is generating electricity, and we need to be able to pick up that electricity, and we can do that with scalp electrodes. And what you see over here is a sound wave and a brain wave, and you can see that the two actually physically resemble each other. In fact, so much so that you can take the brain wave and play it out through a speaker, and it will resemble the sound wave. So you're going to hear first the sound wave, and the brain's response. You'll hear a scale and the brain's response to the scale. And my favorite. So you see, we have a lot to work with, and we really can access this brain activity with unprecedented precision. And with a single response from the brain, we're able to measure how the brain processes the various sound ingredients that Charles was talking about: harmony, rhythm, timbre, pitch. And we're able to see how good a job, so this is a mixing board analogy, how good a job an individual's brain does at processing those ingredients. So that if you have a lot of enrichment in sound, say you're a musician, your response to these sound ingredients might look like this. If you have a disorder, the response might look like this combination. And one of the things that we know is that children who are raised in poverty often have linguistic deprivation, which we have learned leads to a disorder in the processing of sound, which can be catastrophic for the development of language skills. And one of the things that we have discovered is that playing music actually can help partially offset this problem.
Now, many of you have heard this idea that music is the universal language, but it's not really clear what that means. We talked earlier about how there's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences between these two. Yet, you all sort of know what it means in the sense that you can go anywhere in the world and play music with somebody, and you'll be able to communicate with one another. And so, we wanted to perform a brain experiment where we look at this question of a musical conversation. And so I'm going to invite you again to hear the wonderful Gilbert Castellanos trio, and they're going to be doing something called trading. During trading, what takes place is what we call a musical conversation. So in the lab, we actually then did sort of an experiment about that. We had this time not just one piano player, but two piano players. And one person was in the scanner, and one person was in the control room. And they were playing and having this sort of musical conversation. Now, you can analyze every note. This is actually every note that was recorded in the lab. And this took a long time. But basically, you can look at it from a musicological perspective and say, OK, this is what they were playing in terms of sheet music. You can also look at the statistics of what they were playing in terms of melodic expectancy, and you can see that compared to a control condition shown in black, the musicians that are improvising are actually being less predictable, but there's a correlation between what comes before and what comes after, implying that there's interaction. So spontaneous creative interaction that is them communicating with one another. And then you can look at brain activity. And what I'm showing you here is, again, a comparison map or a contrast map of the brain activity that was specific to the musical conversation. And in this musical conversation, what's notable, now there were no words exchanged during this conversation, but the brain map shows classic language areas of the brain being active during this musical conversation. And so in other words, the musicians are employing their basic speech areas to have this musical conversation. However, there's something in blue there called the angular gyrus. And this is an area of the brain that's involved in something called semantic cognition, or the meaning of words, how it is that we determine what a word means when it's uttered to us. And this part of the brain was not active during a musical conversation. So we think what's happening is this unusual combination of language areas of the brain being highly active, but without the involvement of semantic cognition regions. And this might be part of why it's possible that music could be a universal language.
So, a baby's crying. Turns out that if you have musical experience, your brain is simply better at picking out the meaning, the emotional meaning out of sound. So here is the tricky part, the meaningful part of the sound that the musicians, so people with musical experience, and I'm not talking about professional musicians, but people who regularly engage in making music, are able to process that information more precisely, as opposed to the simple part of sound, which the non-musicians are holding on to for dear life, because that's really the part that they're processing the best. And at the same time, the musicians are saving their neural resources, are not responding very much to those simple parts of the baby's cry, but they're saving those neural resources for the tricky stuff. So we do know that although music and language are quite different, language and music abilities coincide.
Now, what if they don't coincide that well? Now, here is a little girl. She's very adorable, and let's just watch her playing for a little bit.
That's an owl. Owl. Yeah. Owl. Owl. Yeah. Baby. Baby. You want it?
Now, what some of you may have noticed about this little girl is that she's deaf. Right? She couldn't hear a thing. She was born profoundly deaf at birth, and she was diagnosed rather early. And so it turns out that in modern medicine today, we have a lot of options to treat hearing loss that just simply used to not exist. I mean, back in the 1800s, they used to do funny things like take ear-shaped objects and put them in your ears. Now we have modern hearing aids, bone-anchored hearing devices, cochlear implants. And the cochlear implant has really revolutionized the treatment of significant hearing loss for people with deafness. Now, this patient's family, after a series of discussions, elected to have a cochlear implant placed. And this is sort of an example of what an electrode looks like when it's put into the inner ear of somebody who's deaf. And now we're going to meet this child again, who was implanted by my mentor, Dr. John Naparco. We're going to meet her again 10 years after her surgery.
So you've written 2 books.
I've written 2 books.
Was the other one a book or like a journal entry?
No, the other one was a book.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah.
Well, this book has 7 chapters, and the last chapter is entitled "The Good Things About Being Deaf." Do you remember writing that chapter?
Yes, I do. I remember writing every chapter.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes my sister can be kind of annoying, so it comes in handy to not be annoyed by her.
I see. And who is that?
Collie,
Okay.
Her sister.
Her sister.
my sister.
And how can you avoid being annoyed by her?
I just take off my CI and I don't hear anything. So it's pretty, it comes in handy.
So you don't want to hear everything that's out there.
No.
Now, I mean, this girl is amazing, right? She's a star performer, and we would think of this as a major success from the medical perspective. And it is. I mean, she's living a fantastic life. She's extremely happy. Now, something happens, though, when she turns on the radio, or when she sits down at a piano. Rather than this nice linear arrangement of notes that we kind of think of as commonplace at a piano, or the radio sounding good, which we usually hope for when we listen to music, for her, the piano is more like this. And why is that? It's that music is so hard for the cochlear implant to handle, because as I said, it's a more difficult stimulus than speech, that these implant devices, they don't really have a chance right now to faithfully transmit all of the information that music requires. And so it turns out that pitch perception is the biggest problem right now for a cochlear implant user, and that actually this is even better probably than it really is for her, because there's actually usually missing keys or particularly wide keys where 4 notes, 5 notes will sound exactly the same. And so it's a major obstacle in getting somebody who's deaf and then restoring what we would call perfect hearing. And this is something that we've been working on actively in the lab. Now, some of the ways we try to work on this in the lab is to have some help with deaf animals. And so this is a deaf white cat. This is work that I helped out with Dr. David Riugo, who was one of my closest mentors back in the 90s and a world-famous auditory neuroscientist. Now, what we did in this effort was put a cochlear implant into a cat that could not hear, and then through a long series of efforts in his lab, train this cat to respond to a bugle call for food. Now, I'm not saying that that cat likes trumpet or jazz or can tell the difference between that call and Gilbert Castellanos, but I am saying that this animal was trained to imbue a musical sound with significance, and that's what hearing in music is all about, trying to imbue it with significance. And so I'm going to now introduce you to a young man, a student of mine, was in my lab for 3 years, one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. Again, born deaf, but trilingual in tonal languages as well. And you're going to see him play the piano.
So I was born in 1986, and at about 4 months old, I was diagnosed with profound sensory hearing loss. Not long after, I was fitted with hearing aids. But although these hearing aids were the most powerful hearing aids on the market at the time, they weren't very helpful. As a result, I had to rely on lip reading a lot, and I couldn't really hear what people were saying. When I was 12 years old, I was one of the first few people in Singapore to undergo cochlear implantation. And not long after I got my cochlear implant, I started learning how to play the piano, and it was absolutely wonderful. Since then, I've never looked back.
Now again, so this is a completely deaf individual who, through cochlear implantation, you can tell his hearing is still affected, yet he's able to enjoy at least some of what music has to offer, and he's trying all the time, and he's now actually one of the few physicians in training now in the United States at Johns Hopkins Hospital with deafness. It's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. Now, we're going to shift gears a little bit and tell you why a skull might be a sign of hope, because it turns out that this skull is Beethoven's.
So, hearing loss and the musical brain. We weren't able to measure Beethoven's hearing the way we're able to measure hearing these days, but there's quite a good amount of documentation about the extent of his hearing loss. This is what he wrote to a friend of his. He says, "My ears whistle and buzz continuously. I can truly say I am living a wretched life. I can hear the low pitches of conversations, but I do not understand the words." In fact, he had people writing to him so that he could have some kind of a conversation. "I do not hear the high tones of instruments. For me, there can be no recreation in a society of my fellows, no mutual exchange of thought. I must live like an exile." So he wrote this to his friend in 1801, and this was pretty early on in his deafness. And so by the time we get to 1824, when he wrote his Ninth Symphony, he might have heard it something like this. So we can really see that we must hear with our brains, in that he was able to write so much of the music that we are privileged to be able to enjoy while he was hearing it through his mind's ear. And this is a mask taken of Beethoven's face shortly after his death. And before he died, he wrote probably one of the most beautiful pieces ever. And this is a piece that, is going to be played for you right now by the San Diego Symphony String Quartet. And the music and the musicians will speak for themselves.